London, 1824. The Ashworth ballroom gleamed beneath 1,000 candles, their light reflecting off gilded mirrors and crystal chandeliers that hung like frozen waterfalls from the vaulted ceiling. The air thrummed with the refined energy of the season's most anticipated event, where England's finest gathered in silks and jewels that rivaled the crown's own treasury. Ladies in elaborate gowns of pearl-white satin and gentlemen in impeccably tailored evening dress moved through the space like pieces on a grand chessboard, each step calculated for maximum social advantage. The orchestra, positioned on a raised dais draped in crimson velvet, filled every corner of the magnificent hall with the dulcet strains of a waltz. Marguerite Bellamy stood at the periphery of this glittering spectacle, her fingers nervously smoothing the modest lavender silk of her gown. Unlike the other young ladies present, whose dresses featured the latest Parisian designs with layers of costly lace and elaborate embroidery, her attire was simple, though well-made. She had arrived with her aunt, Lady Harriet Bellamy, a widow of modest means, whose invitation to the ball came more from long-standing family connections than current social prominence. Marguerite harbored no illusions about her place in this world of wealth and privilege. Her father had been a country gentleman of respectable but unremarkable lineage, and his passing 3 years prior had left his only daughter with a small inheritance that afforded comfort, but not luxury. Se você gosta de histórias como esta, inscreva-se em nosso canal. The young woman had come to London for the season at her aunt's insistence, though she possessed neither the fortune nor the connections to make a brilliant match. At 22, she was already considered somewhat past the first bloom of youth by society's exacting standards. Her beauty was of a quieter sort, soft brown curls that refused to hold the fashionable ringlets, thoughtful grey eyes that observed more than they sought attention, and a figure that was graceful without being remarkable. She had learned early in her 3 weeks in town that invisibility often proved more comfortable than the cruel scrutiny of the ton. As the evening progressed, Marguerite found herself content to watch the dancers swirl past, noting with an anthropologist's interest the various social dramas playing out across the ballroom floor. She observed the desperate mamas angling for introductions to wealthy bachelors, the young bucks showing off their athletic prowess in the quadrille, the dowagers gossiping behind their fans about every perceived scandal and social misstep. This world fascinated her even as it made her feel utterly foreign, like a naturalist observing an exotic species from a safe distance. What Marguerite did not notice was that she herself had become the subject of intense observation. Maximilian Hawthorne, the Duke of Ashford, stood in the shadows of an alcove, a crystal glass of brandy forgotten in his hand as his dark eyes fixed upon the young woman in lavender. At 30 years of age, he was considered one of the most eligible and least approachable men in England. His wealth was legendary, his estates vast, his lineage impeccable. His appearance commanded attention, tall and broad-shouldered, with aristocratic features that seemed carved from marble, dark hair that fell in fashionable waves, and penetrating blue eyes that many ladies claimed could freeze or ignite with equal intensity. Yet it was his reputation that truly defined him in society's imagination. The Duke of Ashford was known throughout London as the Ice Duke, a man whose heart seemed as cold as his manner was correct. Since inheriting the title at 21 following his father's sudden death, Maximilian had thrown himself into managing his estates with ruthless efficiency. He attended the necessary social functions, fulfilled his duties to Parliament, and maintained the standards expected of his position with flawless precision. What he did not do was engage in frivolous pursuits, show warmth to debutantes thrust in his path, or exhibit any interest in the marital state, despite endless pressure from his mother and society at large. Those who knew him in his youth sometimes spoke of a different man, one who had laughed freely, pursued scholarly interests with passion, and shown promise of becoming a warm and generous lord. But that young man had vanished in the crucible of sudden responsibility and private grief that few understood. The present Duke maintained cordial but distant relations even with his closest acquaintances, conducted his affairs with methodical precision, and seemed utterly immune to the charms deployed by countless ambitious ladies. Until this moment, watching a young woman who seemed determined to make herself invisible, Maximilian could not have articulated what arrested his attention so completely. Perhaps it was the way she stood apart from the social maneuvering that consumed everyone else, or the gentle intelligence visible in her expression as she observed the crowd. Perhaps it was the unconscious grace with which she moved when she finally accepted a dance from a red-faced young lieutenant, her steps perfectly timed, though she made no effort to draw attention to her skill. Or perhaps it was simply that in a room full of women desperate for his notice, she was the only one who looked at him with complete indifference when their paths briefly crossed near the refreshment table. That single moment of accidental eye contact had lasted no more than 2 seconds. Marguerite, reaching for a glass of lemonade, had glanced up to find an extraordinarily handsome gentleman standing nearby. Their eyes met. She registered a brief impression of striking blue eyes and imposing height. Then she looked away without a flicker of recognition or interest, her attention already returning to her search for her aunt in the crowd. She had no idea she had just dismissed the most sought-after peer in the realm, but Maximilian knew precisely whom he had encountered, though he had never been formally introduced. He had watched her arrive earlier in the evening, noted her name when his mother mentioned in passing that Harriet Bellamy had brought her niece to town. The Ice Duke spent the remainder of the ball in a state entirely foreign to his recent experience, utterly preoccupied with a woman who had no idea of his interest and no apparent desire for his attention. When Marguerite and her aunt departed shortly before midnight, she carried with her only the pleasant memory of an evening spent observing a world that would never truly include her. She had danced 4 times with perfectly nice gentlemen who would never call on her, had eaten some excellent cake and had successfully avoided any embarrassing incidents. As their modest carriage rattled through the London streets toward her aunt's townhouse in an unfashionable but respectable quarter, Marguerite felt satisfied with the evening's outcome. She could not have imagined that the most powerful duke in England had watched her leave with an expression that would have astonished anyone who saw it. One of a man who had just discovered he was not made of ice after all. The following morning dawned cold and bright, with thin winter sunlight struggling through the perpetual coal smoke that hung over the city. Marguerite rose early, as was her habit, and dressed in a simple morning gown of blue muslin before descending to the breakfast room. Her aunt's house was a narrow but comfortable establishment, maintained by a small staff that managed admirably given Lady Harriet's limited resources. The older woman believed in making a good appearance in society while practicing strict economy in private, a balance Marguerite understood and respected. She had just settled down with tea and toast when her aunt burst into the room, waving a crisp piece of correspondence as though it were a battle standard. "My dear girl, you will never believe what has arrived this morning." Lady Harriet's thin face was flushed with excitement, her grey curls still in papers beneath her lace cap. "An invitation to a musicale at Hartfield House this very evening. The Countess of Hartfield's gatherings are notoriously exclusive. I cannot fathom how we should have attracted such attention, but this is a marvellous opportunity." Marguerite accepted the invitation with mild curiosity, noting the heavy cream paper and elegant script. "That is indeed kind of the Countess, though I confess I did not even make her acquaintance last evening." "Perhaps someone spoke well of you," her aunt said hopefully, already mentally reviewing Marguerite's wardrobe for suitable attire. "We must make an excellent impression, my dear. One never knows what connections might be formed at such gatherings. What neither woman could have known was that the invitation had been secured through the machinations of the Duke of Ashford, who had appeared at Hartfield House at an unconscionably early hour that morning to request a favour from his godmother. Lady Hartfield, a sharp-eyed woman of 60 with a reputation for matchmaking, had listened to his carefully casual inquiry about whether Lady Harriet Bellamy and her niece might be added to the guest list with barely concealed delight. "So the Ice Duke thaws at last," she had murmured, studying her godson's studiously neutral expression. "And for a nobody with no fortune or connections, how deliciously unexpected. I merely think it would be courteous to extend our circles to include respectable persons who might otherwise be overlooked," Maximilian had replied with perfect coolness, though his clenched jaw betrayed his discomfort. "Of course, my dear boy, and I am the Queen of Sheba." But she had written the invitation immediately, her mind already spinning with possibilities. Thus it was that Marguerite found herself that evening in another grand house, though the atmosphere here was more intimate than the previous night's ball. Perhaps 40 guests gathered in a drawing room decorated in the Chinese style, with hand-painted wallpaper depicting exotic birds and flowering trees. A pianoforte occupied one corner, where a celebrated soprano was to perform, while small groupings of chairs and sofas encouraged conversation. Servants circulated with champagne and delicate refreshments. Marguerite accepted a glass of champagne from a footman and prepared herself for another evening of pleasant observation. Her gown tonight was a soft rose silk that had belonged to her mother, altered to suit current fashion, though still noticeably a few seasons out of style. She had just found a seat near the window when a shadow fell across her vision. "Miss Bellamy, I believe, though we have not been formally introduced. I am Ashford." Marguerite looked up to find the striking gentleman from the previous evening standing before her, and the introduction suddenly clarified his identity. The Duke of Ashford, the Ice Duke himself. Every unmarried woman in London had been told about him. His wealth, his coldness, his complete unavailability, despite being the most eligible bachelor in England. Marguerite rose and curtsied with appropriate respect, utterly bewildered as to why such a man should seek her out. "Your Grace, I am honored," she said, her voice steady despite her confusion. "I wonder if I might claim the seat beside you," Maximilian said, already moving to do so before she could respond. "I find I am weary of standing, and you seem to have found the most sensible vantage point in the room. Se você gosta de histórias como esta, inscreva-se em nosso canal." As he settled beside her, Marguerite became acutely aware of his physical presence, the breadth of his shoulders, the expensive scent of sandalwood and leather, the way his elegant evening clothes displayed a physique that spoke of athletic pursuits rather than indolent privilege. She found herself unaccountably nervous, though she could not have said why. Dukes had never featured in her practical plans for the future, which involved eventually accepting a position as a governess or companion rather than making any sort of brilliant match. "I trust you enjoyed the Ashworth ball last evening," he said, his deep voice carrying the cultured accent of the highest aristocracy. "Very much, Your Grace. It was a splendid affair." "Yet you left before the supper dance. I hope the company did not prove tedious." Marguerite glanced at him in surprise. Had the Duke of Ashford truly noticed her departure from a ball of 300 guests? "Not at all, Your Grace. My aunt prefers to retire early, and I must confess I share her practical nature." "Practical," Maximilian repeated, as though testing the word. "How refreshing. Tell me, Miss Bellamy, what did you think of the evening's entertainment? I confess I find myself curious about your perspective, as you seem to spend much of the evening observing rather than participating." This was so unexpected that Marguerite blinked in surprise. I beg your pardon, Your Grace, but surely you cannot have noticed such a thing. I am hardly memorable in such elevated company." "On the contrary, I found your presence rather impossible to overlook." The words were delivered in his characteristically cool tone, making them seem more observation than compliment. "You have an unusual quality of stillness in a world that constantly demands attention." It intrigued me. Before Marguerite could formulate a response to this extraordinary statement, Lady Hartfield called for attention as the soprano prepared to perform. The interruption perhaps saved Marguerite from betraying her complete bewilderment, though she remained intensely aware of the Duke seated beside her throughout the performance. He did not speak again during the music, but she could feel his attention like a tangible force, though when she dared a sidelong glance, his expression revealed nothing. When the performance concluded, and guests rose to mingle, Maximilian stood and offered his arm. "Would you accompany me to the refreshment table, Miss Bellamy? I find myself in need of something to restore my nerves after that woman's assault on Mozart." The unexpected criticism, delivered in perfectly deadpan tones, startled a laugh from Marguerite before she could prevent it. She quickly covered her mouth, shocked at her own breach of politeness, but when she looked up at the Duke, she caught the faintest glimmer of amusement in those ice-blue eyes. "You are too diplomatic to agree aloud, but I saw your wince during the high notes," he observed as she took his arm. "A lady of discernment as well as discretion." As they made their way through the crowd, Marguerite became aware of the attention their pairing attracted. Conversations paused. Fans were deployed to hide whispered speculations, and more than one ambitious mama looked daggers at this nobody who had somehow captured the Ice Duke's notice. Marguerite felt increasingly uncomfortable with the scrutiny, having no desire whatsoever to become the subject of society gossip. At the refreshment table, the Duke procured her a glass of champagne and a delicate confection before steering her toward a less crowded corner. "You seem distressed, Miss Bellamy. I hope I have not imposed unwanted attention upon you. I confess I am somewhat puzzled as to why you should seek my company at all, Your Grace," Marguerite said, with more honesty than was perhaps prudent. "I am nobody of consequence, and surely you have more suitable companions available." "Suitable," Maximilian repeated, with that same testing quality he had applied to the word practical. What an absolutely deadening concept. "Tell me, do you always measure yourself against such arbitrary standards?" "I merely understand my place in the world, Your Grace. It saves much disappointment." "Does it? Or does it perhaps prevent one from reaching for things that might bring genuine happiness?" He sipped his champagne, studying her over the rim of the glass. "I find I have little patience for the games society plays, Miss Bellamy. People spend so much effort trying to be what they think others expect that they forget to discover what they might truly want." "And what is it you truly want, Your Grace?" The question escaped before Marguerite could consider the impertinence of asking such a thing. For a long moment Maximilian simply looked at her, and something in his expression made her breath catch. "I am only just beginning to understand that myself, Miss Bellamy. But I believe it begins with honest conversation with someone who sees the world clearly, rather than through the distorted lens of ambition and pretense." Before Marguerite could respond to this cryptic statement, they were interrupted by Lady Hartfield, who descended upon them with the determination of a general executing a battle plan. "Ashford, you are monopolizing Miss Bellamy most shamefully. I must steal her away to introduce her to some young people who share her interest in literature. Come along, my dear." As Marguerite was swept away, she glanced back to find the Duke watching her departure with an expression she could not read. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of introductions and polite conversation, yet she found her thoughts returning again and again to those strange moments in the corner with the Ice Duke, trying to decipher what had just occurred. The mystery only deepened over the following days, as Marguerite found herself unexpectedly included in a series of exclusive social events. Invitations arrived for a card party at Lady Pemberton's, a theatre outing organised by Mrs. Whitmore, and a riding party in Hyde Park that would normally be far above her social reach. Lady Harriet was beside herself with excitement and confusion, unable to explain their sudden popularity, but determined to capitalize on it. What neither woman realized was that these invitations were not accidental. The Duke of Ashford moved through his social world with quiet purpose, mentioning to carefully selected hostesses that Miss Marguerite Bellamy was a young lady of intelligence and character who deserved wider acquaintance. His recommendations carried enormous weight, and within days, Marguerite found herself swept into circles she had never imagined accessing. Yet the Duke himself seemed to maintain a certain distance. He appeared at the same events, certainly, but he did not monopolize her attention or make his interest obvious. Instead, he would materialize at her side during a lull in conversation, exchange a few words of unexpected insight or dry humor, then fade back into the crowd before anyone could remark upon it. It was as though he were conducting some elaborate dance, advancing and retreating according to rules only he understood. Marguerite found herself increasingly confused, and though she hesitated to admit it, disappointed. Despite her practical nature and awareness of the vast gulf between their stations, she could not deny that the Duke intrigued her profoundly. His rare smiles felt like precious gifts. His observations revealed a mind of considerable depth and surprising unconventionality, and his presence seemed to create a bubble of calm amid the chaos of social obligations. She began to watch for him at events, then chastised herself for such foolishness. Dukes did not seriously pursue penniless country gentlewomen, regardless of how attentive they might occasionally seem. On the 5th day following the musicale, Marguerite was reading in her aunt's modest drawing-room when the butler entered with an expression of barely contained astonishment. "Miss Bellamy, the Duke of Ashford is here to call upon you. He awaits in the front parlour." Marguerite nearly dropped her book. "Here? The Duke is here?" "Indeed, miss, he arrived in his crested carriage just moments ago and requested to speak with you, with Lady Harriet's permission, naturally." Lady Harriet, who had been corresponding with friends at the writing desk, leapt to her feet with such vigour she nearly overturned her chair. "Good heavens! The Duke of Ashford calling here! Marguerite, check your hair! No, wait, change your dress! No, there is no time! Oh, this is unprecedented!" "Aunt, please calm yourself," Marguerite said, though her own heart raced. "I cannot imagine what he wants, but I shall receive him and discover his purpose." She descended to the front parlour with as much composure as she could muster, Lady Harriet trailing behind as an appropriately vigilant chaperone. The Duke stood by the window, examining a rather mediocre landscape painting on the wall. He turned as they entered, and Marguerite was struck anew by his commanding presence. In the modest confines of her aunt's parlour, his height and breadth seemed even more impressive, his expensively tailored morning coat and perfectly arranged cravat a stark contrast to the room's shabby gentility. "Miss Bellamy, Lady Harriet, thank you for receiving me," he said with a formal bow. "I apologize for calling without prior arrangement, but I find myself in need of advice from someone of good sense and intelligence, and you, Miss Bellamy, struck me as possessing both qualities in abundance." This was so unexpected that Marguerite could only stare for a moment before remembering her manners. "I am honoured by your confidence, Your Grace, though I cannot imagine what advice I could offer to someone of your experience and standing. On the contrary, it is precisely because you stand outside my usual circles that I value your perspective." He glanced at Lady Harriet, who had settled herself in a chair by the door, with an expression of intense curiosity. "I find myself needing to select a birthday gift for my sister, who has recently turned 18. She is an intelligent young woman with interests beyond the usual feminine accomplishments, but I confess I am at a loss. The women of my acquaintance suggest jewellery or fine clothing, but these seem inadequate. You strike me as someone who would appreciate thoughtfulness over ostentation. What would you recommend?" The question was so genuine, delivered without any trace of condescension, that Marguerite found herself relaxing slightly. "May I ask what subjects interest your sister, Your Grace?" "She reads voraciously, particularly natural philosophy and travel narratives. She also maintains extensive gardens at our country estate, and has expressed interest in landscape design, though our mother considers this an unsuitable pursuit for a young lady of her station." Marguerite smiled at this, her natural enthusiasm overcoming her nervousness. "Then I would suggest a first edition of Maria Graham's Journal of a Residence in India, if you can procure one, as it combines both travel observation and botanical detail. Alternatively, Humphrey Repton's works on landscape design would be both beautiful and practical, though I confess either choice might further encourage her in pursuits her mother deems unsuitable." Maximilian's austere features transformed with a genuine smile that altered his entire aspect. "Perfect. You have confirmed what I suspected, that what my sister needs is not another piece of jewellery she will never wear, but acknowledgement that her interests have value. Thank you, Miss Bellamy. I am glad to be of service, Your Grace." He made no move to leave, instead continuing to stand there, as though weighing some decision. Finally, he spoke again. "I wonder if I might impose further upon your good nature. I am hosting a small gathering at my estate just outside London this Saturday. A country party with perhaps 20 guests. It will be quite informal by town standards, with opportunities for walking the grounds, exploring the library, and engaging in reasonable conversation rather than the usual social performing. Would you and Lady Harriet do me the honour of attending?" Lady Harriet made a small squeaking sound of delight that she quickly converted into a cough. Marguerite felt her pulse accelerate even as her practical nature raised immediate objections. "Your Grace, that is extraordinarily kind, but surely—" "Please do not cite your station or connections as reasons to refuse," Maximilian interrupted gently. "I have extended this invitation because I find your company refreshing and your perspective valuable. If you find the company of a solitary duke and his guests unappealing, then by all means decline. But if it is only worry about propriety that makes you hesitate, then I assure you that as host, I determine what is proper under my own roof." The quiet authority with which he said this, combined with something almost vulnerable in his expression, decided her. "Then we should be honoured to attend, Your Grace." "Excellent. I shall send my carriage for you Saturday morning at 10. The journey is less than 2 hours." He bowed formally. "Until then, Miss Bellamy, Lady Harriet." After he departed, Lady Harriet collapsed dramatically onto the sofa. "Marguerite, do you understand what has just occurred? The Duke of Ashford, the Ice Duke himself, has invited you to his private estate. This is unheard of. He has never shown interest in any woman since inheriting the title. What can it possibly mean?" But Marguerite, staring at the door through which he had departed, was asking herself the same question and finding no satisfactory answer. She knew only that something was unfolding, that terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure, and that she had just crossed some invisible threshold from which there might be no return. Saturday arrived with unseasonably warm weather, and the journey to Ashford Hall proved as pleasant as promised. The estate, when it finally came into view, exceeded Marguerite's expectations despite her attempts to prepare herself. The great house rose from manicured grounds like something from a painting, its honey-coloured stone glowing in the midday sun. Formal gardens gave way to parkland, designed in the naturalistic style, with artfully placed groves of trees and a small lake glittering in the distance. The Duke himself greeted them at the entrance, flanking his guests with the ease of long practice, while managing to convey that their arrival particularly pleased him. He introduced them to the other guests, a careful mixture of interesting people, including a celebrated botanist, a lady novelist who wrote under a masculine pseudonym, a former military officer turned reformer, and several young people of intelligence and unconventional interests. Notably absent were the gossips and social climbers who populated most London gatherings. "I have arranged for chambers where you might rest from the journey," Maximilian told them. "But if you are not fatigued, I would be pleased to show you the gardens before luncheon. My sister has been working on a rather innovative design for the South Terrace, and I believe you would appreciate her efforts, Miss Bellamy." Thus it was that Marguerite found herself walking through truly spectacular gardens, with the Duke at her side. Lady Harriet, having been smoothly directed to the company of an old school friend among the guests. The gardens proved as impressive as the house, clearly the work of someone with both artistic vision and botanical knowledge. As they walked, the Duke proved a surprisingly engaging guide, explaining his sister's work with evident pride, while also revealing his own considerable knowledge of horticulture. "You seem surprised that I should know the Latin names of plants," he observed with amusement as they paused by a bed of early roses. "I confess I am," Marguerite admitted. "It seems an unusual interest for a duke." "Why? Because dukes are supposed to confine themselves to hunting, drinking, and parliament." His tone was dry. "I assure you that reality can be deathly dull. I find plants considerably better company than most members of the Lords." This startled a laugh from her, and she saw him smile in response, clearly pleased to have amused her. They continued their walk, and Marguerite found herself relaxing in his company, as she never had in town. Here, away from the watchful eyes of society, the Duke seemed different, less guarded, more willing to reveal the intelligent, thoughtful man beneath the aristocratic reserve. "May I ask you something, Your Grace?" she ventured, as they reached a small ornamental bridge over a stream. "I wish you would call me Ashford, or better yet, Maximilian. Your Grace makes me feel like I'm being addressed by a servant or a supplicant." "That would be rather too familiar, Your Grace. Even in private, when no one can hear, to be shocked." He turned to face her fully, his expression serious. "Miss Bellamy, Marguerite, if I may, I believe we have moved beyond the strictest forms of society's dance. I would like you to feel comfortable speaking freely with me." The use of her given name, delivered in that deep voice, sent an unexpected warmth through her. "Very well, Maximilian." She tested the name, found it suited him. "What I wish to ask is why you have gone to such efforts on my behalf. The invitations, the attention, this weekend. I am not fool enough to believe this is normal behavior for a duke toward a woman of no particular standing." He was quiet for a long moment, looking out over the water. When he finally spoke, his voice carried an unusual note of vulnerability. "Do you know what it is like to perform a role so completely that you forget the person you were before? For 9 years, I have been the Duke of Ashford, executing my duties with precision, managing estates and investments, fulfilling obligations to family and crown. I have been excellent at it, if I may say so without false modesty. But somewhere in that performance, I lost track of Maximilian Hawthorne, the man who once wanted things simply because they brought him joy. He turned to face her again. Then I saw you at the Ashworth ball and you were not performing. You were simply being observant, intelligent, present. You did not see the Duke of Ashford and calculate how to use me for advancement. You saw another person at a ball and looked away without interest or design. Do you have any idea how extraordinary that was? Marguerite felt her breath catch at the intensity in his gaze. I did not mean to offend by my indifference. You did not offend. You awakened something I had thought frozen beyond recovery. He took a step closer, though still maintaining proper distance. I have spent these days arranging opportunities to know you better, and everything I have learned confirms my initial impression. You are intelligent without pretension, kind without weakness, honest without cruelty. You see clearly, but without cynicism. And when I am in your presence, I remember what it feels like to be more than a title and a set of obligations. Maximilian, she whispered, overwhelmed by the confession. I do not know what to say. Then say nothing yet. Simply allow me to continue knowing you, and consider whether you might find enjoyment in my company beyond the fear of what society might think. He offered his arm again. Come, I believe luncheon will be served shortly, and I would very much like to hear your opinion of Mrs. Crawford's latest novel, which I believe you have read. The remainder of the weekend passed in a dreamlike haze for Marguerite. She found herself part of stimulating conversations about art, literature, science, and philosophy, topics rarely addressed in fashionable society beyond the most superficial level. She walked the grounds with various guests, explored the magnificent library, and played chess with the botanist, who proved a formidable opponent. Throughout it all, Maximilian was a presence both constant and subtle, joining conversations that interested him, ensuring all his guests felt welcomed and creating an atmosphere of intellectual engagement that Marguerite had never experienced in London's ballrooms. But it was in the smaller private moments that she felt the full force of his attention, a conversation about poetry in the library while other guests were at tea, a walk by the lake in the early evening, discussing their childhoods and the people who had shaped them, a moment in the music room when she played a simple piece on the pianoforte and looked up to find him watching her with an expression that made her heart race. On Sunday evening, as guests prepared to depart, Maximilian found her in the rose garden where she had gone to steal a few moments of solitude before the journey back to London. Marguerite, he said softly, and she turned to find him approaching with that purposeful stride she had come to recognize. I wanted to thank you properly for your hospitality, she began, but he raised a hand to gently interrupt. I need to speak plainly with you before you leave, because I find I cannot continue this dance any longer without declaring my intentions. He moved closer, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. I am not a man given to impulse or romantic fancy. I am methodical, deliberate, and perhaps too controlled for my own good. But since the moment I saw you at that ball, something has been awakening in me that I thought long dead. Maximilian, please. She was frightened suddenly, frightened of the intensity in his expression and the wild hope rising in her own chest. I am falling in love with you, Marguerite Bellamy. The words were delivered with absolute certainty, as though he were stating an incontrovertible fact. I do not say this to frighten you or to demand any response. I say it because I have spent too many years locked away from genuine feeling, and you have shown me that I am still capable of it. Whatever you decide, whatever you feel or do not feel for me, I needed you to know this truth. Marguerite felt tears spring to her eyes, overwhelmed by the enormity of what he was offering. I am nobody, Maximilian. I have no fortune, no connections, no right to aspire to someone like you. Your mother will be appalled. Society will be vicious. I would bring you nothing but complications and scandal. You would bring me joy, he said simply. You would bring me partnership with someone who sees the world clearly and thinks for herself. You would bring me honesty in a world of performance. As for society's opinion, I stopped caring about that years ago. And my mother will learn to appreciate what I appreciate, or she will learn to keep her objections to herself. He took her hand gently, his thumb brushing across her knuckles. I am not asking you to decide anything today. I am not even asking you to return my feelings. though I confess I hope desperately that you might. I'm simply asking for permission to court you properly, to continue seeing you, to discover together whether what I feel might be reciprocated. Will you grant me that much?" Marguerite looked up at this powerful, controlled man who was offering her his carefully guarded heart, and felt her own resistance crumble. "I would be lying if I said I did not feel something for you, Maximilian. You terrify me and fascinate me in equal measure. But I must be honest, I do not know how to navigate your world. I do not know how to be what a duchess should be." "Then it is fortunate that I am not looking for what a duchess should be. I am looking for what Marguerite Bellamy is, exactly as you are." He smiled, that rare, genuine smile that transformed his features. "Say yes, Marguerite. Say you will let me court you, and we will face whatever challenges arise together." She should have been practical. She should have protected her heart and her reputation by refusing this impossible offer. But standing in the rose garden with the setting sun painting the sky gold, and this extraordinary man looking at her with such hope in his eyes, Marguerite discovered she was perhaps not as practical as she had always believed. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Maximilian, I will." The courtship that followed would have provided ample fodder for London's gossips had it been conducted publicly, but Maximilian proved masterful at maintaining discretion while still spending considerable time with Marguerite. He called at her aunt's house at appropriate hours with apparently innocent purposes, bringing his sister to meet her new friend, discussing a book he thought she might enjoy, seeking her advice on charitable projects he supported. He ensured she was invited to gatherings where they might converse, but took care never to monopolize her attention to the point where tongues would seriously wag. Yet beneath this appearance of propriety, something profound was growing. They exchanged letters filled with ideas, observations, and increasingly personal revelations. They found excuses for walks in the park, with Lady Harriet trailing at a discreet distance, attended lectures and exhibitions where they could discuss art and science, and shared quiet moments in crowded rooms where a glance or a smile conveyed more than words could express. Marguerite discovered that the Ice Duke existed only as a facade to protect a man of deep feeling and considerable complexity. Maximilian had learned early that showing emotion was perceived as weakness in his position, that warmth invited exploitation, that maintaining control was the only way to manage the crushing weight of responsibility he had inherited too young. His father's sudden death had thrust him into a role for which he was unprepared, forcing him to abandon his own aspirations and dreams to preserve the family legacy. The cold reserve that society remarked upon was armor forged in grief and necessity. But with Marguerite, the armor fell away piece by piece. He told her about his father, a larger-than-life figure whose expectations had been exacting even as his love had been genuine. He spoke of the terror he had felt at 21, suddenly responsible for estates employing hundreds, investments affecting thousands, political decisions with national implications. He confessed the loneliness of his position, the way people saw only the title rather than the man, treated him as a prize to be won or a tool to be used rather than a human being worthy of genuine connection. In turn, Marguerite shared her own history, a childhood of modest comfort, shadowed by her mother's long illness and eventual death when Marguerite was 15. She spoke of her father, a gentle scholar more interested in his books than in advancing his family's social position, who had taught her to value ideas over appearances. She described the sorrow of losing him to a fever 3 years past, the anxiety of discovering that his generosity had left her with only a small inheritance, the determination to maintain dignity and independence despite reduced circumstances. "I used to dream of being someone remarkable," she admitted one afternoon as they walked through Hyde Park, Lady Harriet determinedly studying a flowerbed some distance away. "But I learned that being remarkable requires advantages I do not possess, so I taught myself to be content with being invisible, with observing life rather than fully participating in it." "And yet you are the most remarkable person I have encountered in London," Maximilian said quietly. "Not because of what you possess, but because of who you are. You have not allowed circumstance to diminish your intelligence, your kindness, or your capacity to see beauty in the world. That requires more strength than you give yourself credit for." These conversations, these moments of genuine understanding, created a bond that transcended the vast difference in their circumstances. Marguerite found herself falling deeply in love with this complicated, controlled man who trusted her with his vulnerabilities. She loved his dry humor, the way his rare laughter transformed his austere features, the intelligence that ranged across topics from agriculture to astronomy. She loved his integrity, the way he took his responsibilities seriously without letting them entirely define him, his determination to use his privilege to effect positive change. But as spring progressed towards summer and their attachment deepened, the practical obstacles became increasingly difficult to ignore. Society was beginning to take notice of the Duke of Ashford's unusual interest in Lady Harriet's modest niece. Whispers circulated in ballrooms and drawing rooms, speculation about whether the Ice Duke could truly be considering such an unsuitable match. Some dismissed it as impossible. Surely the Duke was merely being kind to a respectable but insignificant young woman. Others began sharpening their knives, preparing to tear apart any pretensions this nobody might harbor. The situation came to a head on an evening in late May at Lady Pemberton's ball, an event so grand it rivaled the Ashworth affair, where Marguerite and Maximilian had first encountered each other. Marguerite attended reluctantly, sensing that the social atmosphere had shifted in ways that made her increasingly uncomfortable. She was no longer quite invisible, but neither was she fully accepted. Instead, she occupied an uncomfortable middle ground, where other young ladies regarded her with suspicion and hostility, while their mothers deployed cutting remarks disguised as concern. She was standing near the terrace doors, seeking escape from the suffocating ballroom, when Lady Cynthia Worthington materialized beside her. Lady Cynthia was everything Marguerite was not, a diamond of the first water with a substantial fortune, impeccable lineage, and the kind of classical beauty celebrated in poetry. She had been pursued by every eligible gentleman in London and had apparently set her sights on becoming the Duchess of Ashford, a goal that seemed eminently reasonable, given her qualifications. "Miss Bellamy, how delightful to find you here," Lady Cynthia said with a smile that never reached her cold eyes. "You have become quite the fixture at fashionable events lately. How unexpected for someone of your modest background." "Lady Cynthia," Marguerite replied with careful politeness, recognizing danger. "I feel I must speak to you in a spirit of sisterly concern," the other woman continued, her voice pitched to carry to the nearby listeners who were pretending not to eavesdrop. "There has been talk, you understand, about your friendship with the Duke of Ashford. I am certain you have no improper designs, being a sensible girl, but I worry that you may not fully understand the position you are placing yourself in." "I am not certain I take your meaning, Lady Cynthia. Only that people are beginning to speculate, and such speculation can be damaging to a young woman's reputation. The Duke, you must understand, has certain obligations to his name and position. He will eventually marry someone suitable, someone who can bring connections, fortune, and status to the match, a woman of his own class who understands the demands of such a life." Her smile sharpened. "It would be unfortunate if you were to mistake his kindness for something more serious, only to find yourself humiliated when he makes the inevitable sensible choice." The words struck like physical blows, not because they were untrue, but because they articulated Marguerite's own deepest fears. She had tried so hard not to hope, not to imagine that a duke could truly choose her over every advantage society offered. Yet she had allowed herself to believe in what she felt when they were together, in the words Maximilian had spoken in the rose garden. Now, standing in this ballroom with curious eyes watching and Lady Cynthia's barely concealed contempt on display, the reality of her situation crashed over her with crushing force. "I appreciate your concern, Lady Cynthia," she managed with admirable composure, "but I assure you I harbor no illusions about my place." "I am so relieved to hear it," Lady Cynthia purred. "It would be dreadful to see you hurt when reality asserts itself. The Duke is fond of you, I am sure, but fondness is not the same as serious intent. Men of his station understand the difference, even if young women of limited experience do not always grasp such distinctions." Before Marguerite could formulate a response, a deep voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Lady Cynthia, I was not aware you had appointed yourself arbiter of my intentions or spokesman for my understanding." Both women turned to find the Duke of Ashford standing behind them, his expression glacial and his eyes blazing with barely controlled fury. The surrounding guests, who had been straining to hear the exchange, suddenly found themselves intensely interested in examining their fans or the floor. Lady Cynthia paled but rallied quickly, offering a curtsy and a charming smile. "Your Grace, I meant no offence. I was merely offering friendly advice to Miss Bellamy, who might not fully understand the ways of society." "The ways of society," Maximilian repeated in a tone that could freeze lava. "By which you mean the custom of vicious women using concern as a weapon to tear down those they perceive as threats? I am quite familiar with that particular social custom, Lady Cynthia, and I find it contemptible." The cut was delivered with surgical precision, and Lady Cynthia's face flushed crimson. She opened her mouth to respond, then apparently thought better of it, and retreated with as much dignity as she could muster, leaving Marguerite and Maximilian facing each other, while the entire ballroom watched with undisguised fascination. "Miss Bellamy, would you do me the honor of dancing with me?" Maximilian asked with formal courtesy, though his eyes were still stormy. "Your Grace, I do not think— I am not asking you to think. I am asking you to dance." He held out his hand, and Marguerite, overwhelmed and confused, took it. As he led her onto the dance floor for a waltz, the whispers crescendoed to an audible buzz. The Duke of Ashford, the Ice Duke who never singled out any young lady for particular attention, was dancing with the nobody from nowhere, and he was looking at her with an intensity that made his interest unmistakable. It was a public declaration, whether Marguerite wanted it or not. "You should not have done that," she whispered as they began to move. "You have made everything worse." "I have made everything clear," he corrected, his hand firm at her waist. "I am weary of discretion and patience. I am weary of watching you endure subtle cruelties from people who do not possess a fraction of your worth. And I am especially weary of pretending that what I feel for you is anything less than absolute." "Maximilian, please, no, listen to me, Marguerite." His voice was low but fierce. "I told you in the garden that I was falling in love with you. That was inaccurate. I am not falling. I have fallen completely, irrevocably, with the whole of my heart. I love you with an intensity that astonishes me daily, and I refuse to hide that fact any longer to spare the feelings of people whose opinions I value not at all." Marguerite felt tears threatening, overwhelmed by the declaration and the consequences she could already foresee. "Your family will never accept this. Your mother has expectations. My mother's expectations are her concern, not ours. She will accept what I tell her to accept. Society will tear me apart. They already have begun. Then let them. We will face them together, or we will leave London entirely. I have estates in the country where we could live quite happily without ever attending another insipid ball or enduring another nest of vipers disguised as a drawing room." The waltz continued, and despite her fear and confusion, Marguerite found herself held in the sanctuary of his arms, moving in perfect synchronization as though they had danced together 1,000 times before. Around them the ballroom faded, the watching eyes and whispered speculation becoming insignificant compared to the connection pulsing between them. "I am terrified," she admitted softly. "So am I," he replied with surprising honesty. "I am terrified that you will let fear convince you to refuse what we could have together. I am terrified that I will fail to protect you from the ugliness that will inevitably come. I am terrified that I have waited 9 years to feel alive again, only to lose it now." His grip tightened slightly. "But I am more terrified of returning to the cold, empty existence I maintained before I met you. I would rather face any challenge with you beside me than face safety without you." The waltz ended, and Maximilian led her from the dance floor without releasing her hand, a breach of etiquette that sent fresh waves of speculation through the crowd. He guided her toward the terrace doors, away from the watching masses, until they stood in the cool night air with only the stars as witnesses. "Marguerite Bellamy, I am asking you now, plainly and without pretty words or careful timing, will you marry me? Will you become my wife, my duchess, my partner in all things? Will you take me as I am, flawed and difficult and still learning how to thaw, and help me become the man I was meant to be?" Marguerite looked up at this powerful, complicated man, who was offering her everything while asking for everything in return. She thought of all the practical objections, all the reasons this was impossible. Then she thought of the man she had come to know in their stolen conversations, the vulnerability hidden beneath ducal authority, the depth of feeling he had trusted her with. She thought of how alive she felt in his presence, how their minds met with thrilling symmetry, how his rare smiles felt like sunrise after endless winter. Se você gosta de histórias como esta, inscreva-se em nosso canal. Yes, she said, and watched his expression transform with joy, so profound it took her breath away. Yes, Maximilian, I will marry you. He caught her face between his hands and kissed her with a fervor that erased any doubt about the authenticity of his feelings. When they finally broke apart, both breathless and laughing softly, he rested his forehead against hers. I promise you, Marguerite, whatever challenges we will face them together. I will spend every day of my life ensuring you never regret this decision. I do not regret it already, she said truthfully, though I suspect tomorrow I will be terrified again. Then tomorrow I will remind you why you said yes. He kissed her again, more gently this time. Come, let us return inside and face the masses. We might as well give them something truly spectacular to gossip about. The engagement announcement, when it appeared in the papers 2 days later, created exactly the scandal everyone had anticipated. Society was divided between those who found the match romantic and those who considered it disastrous. The Dowager Duchess of Ashford, Maximilian's mother, descended upon London from her estate in a state of high dudgeon, prepared to demand her son reconsider this disastrous attachment. She arrived at Ashford House on Grosvenor Square like a general marshalling for battle, sweeping into the drawing room where Maximilian awaited her, with Lady Harriet and Marguerite nervously positioned on a sofa. The Dowager was an imposing woman in her 50s, still beautiful despite the severity of her expression, dressed in black silk that somehow managed to convey both mourning and magnificence. Maximilian, she began without preamble, I must assume this announcement in the papers is some sort of elaborate jest or possibly a fever dream from which I have yet to awaken. Surely you cannot seriously intend to marry this person. Miss Marguerite Bellamy, Maximilian supplied coolly. The woman I love and who has done me the honor of accepting my proposal. And yes, mother, I intend to marry her with all possible haste. The banns will be read beginning this Sunday. The Dowager turned her formidable attention to Marguerite, examining her as one might examine a questionable piece of meat at market. You have no fortune, no connections, no training in how to manage a great household or move in elevated circles. You cannot possibly believe yourself equipped to become the Duchess of Ashford. Before Maximilian could respond, with what was clearly going to be a cutting remark, Marguerite stood, her hands clasped to still their trembling. You are absolutely correct, Your Grace. I possess none of those qualifications. I am the daughter of a country gentleman of modest means, with no experience of managing anything grander than my aunt's modest household. I know nothing of the political maneuvering required of a duchess, have never organized events for hundreds of guests, and lack the connections that would be advantageous to the family. The Dowager looked momentarily surprised by this agreement, but Marguerite continued before she could speak. However, I do possess certain qualities that I believe have value. I am intelligent and willing to learn. I am honest and will never flatter your son when he needs truth. I see him as a man rather than merely a title, and I believe that after 9 years of shouldering responsibilities alone, he deserves a partner who values him for himself. I love him with my entire heart, and I will spend my life ensuring he knows that love daily. She met the Dowager's eyes directly, refusing to look away despite her fear. You may think I am not good enough for your son, Your Grace, and by society's measure, you are probably correct. But your son has chosen me nevertheless, and I will not shame that choice by being anything less than the best duchess I am capable of becoming. I will learn what I do not know. I will rise to meet the challenges, and I will never allow the Ashford name to suffer because of my inadequacies. The silence that followed this speech seemed to stretch forever. Then, unexpectedly, the Dowager's stern expression cracked with something that might have been approval. You have courage, at least, and directness. These qualities are not without value. She turned to her son. She will require extensive training in managing the households, understanding protocol, navigating society. I assume you expect me to provide this education? I had hoped you might, Mother, Maximilian said carefully, though I will not force you if you find the prospect too distasteful." The dowager was quiet for a long moment, studying both her son and his intended. Finally she sighed. "You are determined in this course?" "Absolutely." "And you love her?" "Truly? This is not some reaction against society's expectations or rebellion against your duties?" "I love her with certainty. I have never felt about anything else in my life. She makes me want to be better than I have been. She brings joy where there was only duty. And yes, mother, I am determined, with or without your blessing, though I would greatly prefer to have it." The dowager looked at Marguerite again, her expression softening slightly. "My son has been a stranger to happiness for many years. If you have given him reason to smile again, then perhaps there is value in this match beyond what society recognizes." She paused. "Very well. I will train you in your duties, Miss Bellamy, but I warn you, I will be exacting in my expectations, and I will not accept anything less than excellence." "I would expect nothing less, Your Grace," Marguerite replied, weak with relief. What followed were the most intense and exhausting weeks of Marguerite's life. The dowager proved true to her word, subjecting her future daughter-in-law to rigorous instruction in everything from managing household accounts to the intricate protocols of precedence at formal dinners. Marguerite learned which fork to use for which course, how to oversee a staff of 80, the art of gracious conversation with bores, and the delicate dance of maintaining family alliances while navigating political disputes. It was overwhelming, and occasionally terrifying, but Marguerite discovered reserves of determination she had not known she possessed. She rose before dawn to study estate records, practiced formal greetings until her back ached from curtsying, memorized the genealogies of every significant family in England, and learned to project confident authority even when she felt completely out of her depth. The dowager was exacting and sometimes sharp, but Marguerite also detected a grudging respect developing as she demonstrated her commitment to mastering these skills. Through it all, Maximilian remained a steady presence and source of encouragement. He stole moments with her between her lessons with his mother, took her for drives in the park where they could talk freely, and listened patiently when she expressed doubts or frustrations. He made it clear that while he valued her willingness to learn the requirements of her new position, he loved her for herself, not for how perfectly she could execute a formal presentation or manage a dinner for 40. "You will be a magnificent duchess," he told her one evening as they walked through the gardens at Ashford House. "But you would be magnificent to me if you never learned any of these rules. I did not fall in love with your ability to plan seating arrangements or manage household accounts. I fell in love with your mind, your heart, your honest way of seeing the world. Everything else is merely window dressing. Window dressing that will determine whether I embarrass you and your family at every social function," Marguerite replied with a tired laugh. "Then we shall be embarrassed together, and I promise I will not care in the slightest." He pulled her into his arms, heedless of potential observers. "Promise me, Marguerite, that in all this preparation and training, you will not lose the essential quality that drew me to you, your refusal to perform for others' benefit. Be the Duchess of Ashford, yes, but be Marguerite first and always." The wedding took place on a brilliant June morning at St. George's Church in Hanover Square, with all of fashionable London in attendance to witness what many still considered the most shocking match of the season. Marguerite walked down the aisle on her uncle's arm, wearing a gown of white silk so beautiful it brought tears to Lady Harriet's eyes. But she barely registered the magnificent setting or the watching crowds. Her attention was fixed entirely on the man waiting for her at the altar, tall and imposing in formal dress, his ice-blue eyes warm with love as he watched her approach. The ceremony passed in a blur of ancient words and solemn promises. Maximilian's voice was steady and sure as he spoke his vows, his grip on her hand firm and reassuring. When the vicar finally pronounced them man and wife, her husband, kissed her with such tender devotion that several ladies in the congregation dabbed at their eyes. The wedding breakfast that followed at Ashford House was a masterpiece of elegant entertaining, and Marguerite moved through it with newfound confidence, her weeks of intensive training evident in every graceful interaction. The dowager watched with obvious satisfaction as her new daughter-in-law charmed even the most skeptical guests, navigating conversations with diplomacy while maintaining her natural warmth and intelligence. But it was later, when the guests had finally departed, and the newlyweds retired to the private apartments prepared for them, that the true celebration began. Maximilian led his bride into a suite of rooms decorated with exquisite taste, but he bypassed the grandeur to pull her into his arms on the balcony overlooking the gardens. "How does it feel to be the Duchess of Ashford?" he asked, his lips brushing her temple. "Terrifying and wonderful in equal measure," she admitted, relaxing into his embrace. "Ask me again in a year, when I have managed not to create any major scandals." "I would not mind a scandal or two if it meant you remained yourself." He turned her to face him, his expression serious. "Thank you, Marguerite. Thank you for saying yes when every practical consideration argued you should refuse. Thank you for being brave enough to face society's judgment. Thank you for seeing me, rather than merely my title. Thank you for teaching me that I am still capable of joy. Thank you for pursuing me when I tried to make myself invisible," she replied, reaching up to touch his face. "Thank you for being patient with my fears. Thank you for your honesty and your vulnerability. Thank you for choosing love over convenience." He kissed her then, and in that kiss was all the promise of the life they would build together, not perfect, certainly, not without challenges, but authentic and full of genuine partnership. The Ice Duke had thawed completely, and in doing so had discovered that warmth was far superior to the cold isolation he had maintained for so long. The years that followed would prove that their unconventional match was in fact perfectly suited. Marguerite grew into her role as Duchess with grace and intelligence, earning respect, even from those who had initially scorned her. She modernized the management of the Ashford estates, introduced progressive policies for tenant welfare, and became known throughout England as a duchess who combined elegance with genuine compassion and sharp intellect. But more importantly, she and Maximilian built a marriage founded on mutual respect, honest communication, and enduring love. They faced challenges together, from managing complex family dynamics to navigating political upheaval to welcoming 4 children who brought chaos and joy in equal measure. Through it all, they remained partners in the truest sense, each supporting the other's growth while maintaining the individual qualities that had first drawn them together. On a summer evening, 20 years after that fateful ball, where the Duke of Ashford had first noticed a young woman trying to make herself invisible, Marguerite and Maximilian sat in their gardens at the country estate, watching their children play near the lake. His arm was around her shoulders, her head resting on his chest, and the comfort between them spoke of decades of shared life and deep understanding. "Do you remember the night we met?" Maximilian asked suddenly. "When you looked at me with such complete indifference that I was utterly captivated." Marguerite laughed, the sound as warm and genuine as the girl she had been. "I remember being terrified the entire evening and trying desperately not to be noticed by anyone. I succeeded with everyone except the one person whose notice mattered most. I saw you precisely because you were trying not to be seen. You were authentic in a world of performance, present in a room full of people playing roles. You were yourself, Marguerite, and that was the most remarkable thing in that entire ballroom." She turned in his arms to look up at him, seeing the man she loved more deeply with each passing year. "And you saw me when I thought no one would. You chose me when I had nothing to offer but myself. You taught me that being myself was enough." "More than enough," he corrected, kissing her forehead. "Everything." Their eldest daughter called to them from across the lawn, wanting them to settle some dispute between the siblings, and they rose together to attend to their family. But as they walked hand in hand through the gardens they had built together, Marguerite reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with a single evening where she had tried to be invisible. She had thought no one would notice her at the grand ball. She had been spectacularly wrong. One man had noticed, and that had changed everything. Not just her life, but his as well. Together they had proven that the most powerful connections often form in unexpected ways, that love finds its own path regardless of social conventions, and that sometimes the greatest courage lies in allowing yourself to be truly seen by another soul. The Ice Duke had melted in the warmth of genuine love, and in doing so had discovered that the heat of passion and partnership burned far brighter than the cold security of emotional isolation. And the invisible girl who had tried so hard not to be noticed had learned that being seen, truly seen and valued for oneself, was the greatest gift one human being could offer another. Their love story became legendary in time, told and retold as an example of how genuine connection transcends circumstance and status. But for Marguerite and Maximilian, it was simply their life, built day by day through small acts of love, honest communication, shared laughter, and the profound joy of facing the world as true partners. And every year on the anniversary of that first ball, Maximilian would take Marguerite dancing in their private ballroom, holding her close as they moved to the same waltz that had played the night he made his feelings public. It was their private celebration of the moment, when invisibility gave way to recognition, when cold reserve melted into warmth, when two souls found their perfect complement. "I love you," he would whisper as they danced, the words as fresh and true as the first time he had spoken them. "I love you," she would reply, her heart as full as it had been on that overwhelming evening when a duke had declared himself before all of London. And in the morning, they would rise to face whatever challenges awaited, secure in the knowledge that together they could weather any storm, celebrate any joy, and continue building a life defined not by titles or wealth, but by authentic love and genuine partnership. The Invisible Girl and the Ice Duke had found each other across a crowded ballroom, and in doing so had discovered that sometimes the most extraordinary love stories begin with a single unnoticed moment that changes everything. She had thought no one would notice her at the grand ball, but the right person had noticed, and that had made all the difference. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this emotional journey. If this story touched your heart, we invite you to subscribe, like, comment, and share our channel. Your support inspires us to keep creating more stories of love, redemption, and breathtaking twists. Help us reach our first 1,000 subscribers, and together we'll continue sharing tales that warm the heart. At the end of this video, you'll see a suggestion for another of our historical stories. Click and let yourself be enchanted by another unforgettable tale. With all our gratitude, echoes of romance.